Let me tell you something I've never told anyone outside my own family. I was there. I saw it happen. Not on a recording, not as some story passed down through 3 drinking sessions until nobody knows what's true anymore. I was standing maybe 12 paces away, close enough that when it was over, I could smell the burned metal stink in the air and feel my own hands shaking against my sides. And the strange thing is, the part everyone asks me about the slap, that wasn't even the part that scared me. It was the 3 seconds after. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, the way my grandmother used to start her stories. Slow, so you feel it. My name doesn't matter much, but you can call me Vel. I'm Ishani. If you've never met one of us, picture something a little smaller than a human, soft-boned, big dark eyes. The kind of species that learned a long time ago that the safest place to be in any room is near the exit. We're not warriors. We never have been. For most of our history, we survived by being too quiet to notice and too useful to kill. So you can imagine how I felt the day my acceptance to the Coalition Joint Academy came through. The Coalition was the big one, the grand experiment. After the Third Border War, the 4 founding species decided that maybe the reason wars kept happening was that nobody trained together, nobody bled together, nobody learned to trust the people standing at the next post over. So they built an academy out past the Tanny's Gate, on a planet called Meridian, and they started taking cadets from every species willing to send them. Even species like mine. I remember the shuttle ride down. I remember pressing my face to the viewport like a child, watching the academy spread out across the plateau below. It was enormous. Towers of gray alloy catching the light, training fields that stretched to the horizon, and that great central spire they called the Pillar, where the parade ground sat in its shadow like a flat gray stone. I remember thinking, I don't belong here. They'll send me home in a week. What I didn't know yet was that I'd be sharing a barracks block with the humans. You have to understand what humans were back then. This was the golden age, but it wasn't golden because everyone was kind. It was golden because everyone was watching everyone else, waiting to see who'd come out on top. And the humans were the new ones, the unknowns. They'd only joined the Coalition 40 years before, after a first contact that, depending on who you ask, either went very well or very, very badly. Most species didn't know what to make of them. They were dense. That was the first thing the medical drones always flagged. A human's bones, their muscle, the way they were just built, you could see it in the gravity test rooms, where a human would walk through 2.4 standard Gs like they were wading through deep water, sweating and cursing but still walking, while the rest of us were flat on the floor wheezing. They didn't have natural armor. They didn't have venom or claws or any of the things my own ancestors used to fear in the dark. They were just stubborn. Stubborn in a way that went all the way down to the cell. But that's not what made the other species nervous. What made them nervous was that humans didn't seem to understand when they were supposed to lose. There's a concept in most galactic cultures that I don't have a perfect word for in your language. The closest is something like graceful surrender. The understanding that when the odds turn against you, you yield, you preserve yourself, you live to negotiate another day. Every species in the Coalition had some version of it. It was considered wisdom, maturity, the mark of a civilized people. Humans didn't have it. Oh, they could surrender. They were capable of it. But it never came naturally to them, and it never came quietly, and somewhere deep in the back of every other species' brain a little voice would whisper, "What kind of creature has to be taught the value of giving up?" The human I want to tell you about was named Cadet Darrow Keene. I met Keene 3 days into orientation, and I'll be honest, my first impression was that he was going to get someone killed. He wasn't loud, that surprised me. I'd expected all humans to be loud the way the stories said. Keene was the opposite. He was quiet in a way that took up space. He had this stillness to him, the kind you usually only see in the old instructors, the ones who'd actually seen combat. He was tall but not the tallest. He moved like he was always conserving something. The other cadets gravitated to him without quite knowing why. I caught myself doing it too. There was just something steady about him. When the orientation drones malfunctioned and locked half our class in the decontamination corridor, a real thing that happened, the academy's systems were ancient. Everyone started to panic except Keen, who just sat down against the wall, told us all to breathe, and started talking us through it in this low, even voice until the doors finally cycled. I asked him later how he stayed so calm. He looked at me for a second, those flat human eyes, and he said, "Panic is a thing you do to yourself. I just decided not to." I didn't understand it then. I understand it now. We became friends. The kind of friends you make when you're both far from home and both pretty sure you don't belong. He'd ask me about his Shawnee food, which baffled and disgusted him in roughly equal measure, and I'd ask him about Earth, about oceans, about a sky that was blue instead of the pale violet I'd grown up under. We'd sit in the commissary after lights out, when we were supposed to be in our bunks, and we'd just talk. I want you to know that before I tell you the rest. I want you to know he was my friend, and that he was kind, and that none of what happened was because he was cruel or proud or looking for a fight. He never wanted any of it. Now I have to tell you about General Tarsk Vorn. If you've spent any time around the coalition military, you might already know the name, though they don't speak it much anymore. They scrubbed him out of the official histories pretty thoroughly. But back then, Vorn was a name that made instructors stand up straighter. He was Kesari. The Kesari were one of the 4 founding species, old, proud, beautiful in a cold sort of way, tall with that gray-blue skin that seemed to drink the light and long, elegant limbs that ended in those 4-fingered hands. They'd been a warrior people for 10,000 years before my species had even invented the wheel, and they never let anyone forget it. To a Kesari, honor wasn't a feeling. It was a ledger. Every insult was a debt. Every debt had to be paid. And General Vorn was the proudest Kesari I ever saw. He came to Meridian for the Founders' Review, this big ceremonial inspection they did every cycle, where High Command would tour the academy and watch the senior cadets drill. It was a huge deal. We'd been polishing the parade ground for 2 weeks, literally polishing it on our knees, the whole second-year class, because some quartermaster decided the great General Vorn couldn't be allowed to see a single scuff on the stone. The morning of the review, I remember the weather more than anything. Meridian had these strange dry storms that would build up in the afternoons, where you could feel the charge in the air hours before anything happened, a kind of pressure behind your eyes. That morning the sky was the color of old metal, and the wind kept picking up grit off the plateau and throwing it across the field in little hissing sheets. There were maybe 300 of us assembled, cadets in formation, instructors along the edges, and up on the reviewing platform the brass, Academy Command, and Vorn's entourage, all standing in the shadow of the pillar. We stood at attention for a long time. That's the part the stories never tell you. Most of being a soldier is standing still and waiting while important people talk about you somewhere you can't hear. I was 3 rows back. Keen was in the front row on the end because of course he was. He was top of our combat track. The instructors put their best ones up front for the review like fruit in a market stall. And that's where it started. The first hour was just inspection. Vorn walked the line slowly, his entourage trailing behind, his long gray hands clasped behind his back. He'd stop in front of a cadet, look them up and down, sometimes ask a question in that smooth, cold voice of his. Most cadets he ignored. A few he complimented. A couple he tore apart for some imaginary flaw in their bearing just to watch them squirm. You could feel the mood of the field change as he moved down the rows. Cadets who'd been steady all morning started to tremble when his shadow fell over them. There was something about him. A kind of weight. He'd been killing people longer than most of us had been alive, and he wore that fact like cologne. When he reached the front row, he slowed down. I couldn't hear what he said to the first few cadets. The wind was carrying it the wrong way, but I could see their reactions. One of the Drevi cadets, A sweet kid named Solt, who I shared a math tutorial with, went absolutely rigid, his frills flattening against his neck in pure terror. Then Vorn reached Keen. And he stopped. I want to describe this exactly the way I remember it, because I've turned it over in my mind 1,000 times, and the details matter. Vorn stopped in front of Keen and he looked at him. Really looked. Up and down, slow, the way you'd examine an animal you were thinking about buying. And his expression, Kesari faces are hard to read, but I'd been on Meridian long enough to learn a few. His expression curdled into something I recognized. Contempt. See, there was history there, though I didn't know it yet. The Kesari and humanity had a complicated relationship. During the first contact, 40 years before, there'd been an incident. A Kesari survey fleet had encountered a human colony ship and assumed, the way the Kesari always assumed, that the smaller and younger species would yield. The colony ship did not yield. What followed was short and very ugly, and when the dust settled, the Kesari had lost 3 warships to a single unarmed colony vessel, whose crew had improvised weapons out of mining equipment in pure refusal. The Kesari never forgave that. To them it wasn't a battle, it was an insult, a debt. And here was General Vorn, 10,000 years of warrior pride standing in front of him, looking down at a human cadet. "You," Vorn said, loud enough now that the wind carried it back to me. "What is your species?" "Human, sir," Keen said. "Human?" Vorn tasted the word like spoiled food. "I have heard much about humans. I have heard you are strong, durable." He let the word hang. "Like livestock." A ripple went through the formation. Nobody moved, but you could feel 300 cadets holding their breath at once. Keen didn't react. He just stood there, eyes forward, the way you're trained to. That seemed to bother Vorn. He wanted a reaction. The proud ones always do. "I have also heard," Vorn went on, walking a slow circle around Keen now, "that your people do not know their place, that you confuse stubbornness with strength, that you do not understand the difference between courage and ignorance." Still nothing from Keen. I remember my own heart hammering. I remember thinking, "Don't, Darrow. Whatever you're thinking, don't," because I knew him. I knew there was something underneath that stillness, and I'd never seen it tested. Vorn came back around to face him, and he leaned in close, close enough that I imagined Keen could feel his breath, and he said something quiet. The wind ate most of it, but I caught the end. "Your colony at Cephras, I was there. I gave the order." I didn't know what Cephras meant, not then. I learned later. Cephras was a human refugee settlement early in the contact period, a non-combatant colony. There'd been a misunderstanding, the official record said. A Kesari patrol had fired on it. 3,000 civilians. And the officer who gave that order was standing on Meridian 40 years later, leaning into the face of a human cadet, telling him about it. Smiling. He wanted Keen to break. That's what I finally understood much later, lying awake going over it. Vorn didn't care about the review. He didn't care about 300 cadets or the brass on the platform. He'd come all this way and found a human in his path, and he wanted more than anything to make that human do something. React, lash out, crack, so that Vorn could be proven right, so he could say, "See, this is what they are, animals with no discipline. I was right to put them down." It was a trap. The whole thing was a trap, set with the bait of 3,000 dead. And Keen knew it. That's the thing I want you to understand about my friend. He knew. I could see it in him, the way you can only see a thing in someone you know well. His jaw was tight. There was a vein standing out on his neck. His hands at his sides had curled into fists so hard the knuckles had gone white. But he did not move. He stood there and he took it, because he understood exactly what Vorn wanted, and he refused to give it to him. And that was what made Vorn lose control. Because here's the thing about a creature whose entire identity is built on dominance. The worst thing you can do to them isn't to fight back. It's to deny them the fight. Vorn stared at Keen, and the contempt on his face cracked, just for a second, into something rawer. Confusion. And underneath the confusion, the first thin thread of fear. Because he'd come to prove that humans were beasts, and instead he was looking at a young man holding the deaths of 3,000 of his people behind his teeth and choosing, by sheer will, not to react. That was not how it was supposed to go. A Kesari in Vorn's place would have struck, a Drevi would have wept, and a Shani like me would have fled. Every species Vorn knew had a script, and he knew all the scripts. He did not have a script for stillness. And so he did the only thing a creature like that can do when its certainty starts to come apart in its hands. He lashed out. I saw it coming a half-second before it landed, and I still flinched. Vorn's arm came up, that long gray arm, 10,000 years of warrior breeding in the muscle of it, and he struck Keen across the face. Open hand. A slap technically, but there was nothing slight about it. Kesari are strong. The sound of it cracked across the whole parade ground, sharp as a snapped cable, loud enough that birds scattered off the top of the pillar. Keen's head snapped to the side. He staggered half a step. A line of blood opened across his cheekbone where Vorn's hard gray skin had split it. The whole field went silent. 300 cadets dead silent. Up on the platform I saw Academy Command go stiff. This was wrong. This was so far over the line that even the brass didn't know what to do. You did not strike a cadet. Not at a review. Not ever. There were rules written in blood and treaty about exactly this. But nobody moved. Because the one who'd done it was General Tarsk Vorn, and nobody on that platform had the rank or the courage to stop him. Vorn stood there breathing hard, his hand still raised, looking at Keen, waiting. Now his whole body said, "Now you'll show me what you are." And Keen slowly turned his head back. He looked at Vorn, blood running down his face, dripping off his jaw onto the polished stone we'd spent 2 weeks cleaning. He looked at the general who'd murdered 3,000 of his people, and then struck him for refusing to flinch. And he smiled. I'll never forget that smile as long as I live. It wasn't a happy smile. It wasn't even angry, not exactly. It was the smile of someone who has just understood something completely, all at once. The smile of a man who has been handed the one thing he was waiting for. And in that moment, I swear this is true, I watched General Vorn's certainty die. Because Keen's smile wasn't the reaction of a beast. It wasn't rage. It wasn't pain. It was the calm, terrible patience of something far older and far more dangerous than Vorn had ever imagined. And for the first time in maybe 1,000 years, the general realized he had absolutely no idea what he was looking at. Keen reached up, slow, deliberate. He wiped the blood from his cheek with 2 fingers. He looked at it. And then he looked back at Vorn and he spoke, in a voice so quiet that I shouldn't have been able to hear it, except that the whole field had gone so still you could have heard a pin drop on the far side of the pillar. "Thank you," Keen said. "I needed you to do that, in front of witnesses." And the general, the great General Tarsk Vorn, 10,000 years of warrior pride, conqueror of Sephrus, took a step back. Where did I stop? Right, the smile, the blood on the stone, and Keen saying, quiet enough that he shouldn't have been heard but somehow was, "Thank you, I needed you to do that, in front of witnesses." I've thought about those last 3 words more than any others. In front of witnesses. At the time they meant nothing to me. I was a second-year cadet from a species that flees from loud noises. I thought it was a brave thing to say and probably a stupid one. The kind of line a human would deliver right before getting himself expelled, or worse. I braced for what I assumed was coming. I assumed Keen would swing. I assumed there'd be a brawl and then security drones and then a very short, very ugly career for my friend. That's not what happened. What happened took about 3 seconds, and I have spent years trying to slow those 3 seconds down in my head so I could understand them. Let me try to give them to you the way they actually happened, not the way the stories tell it, the way it was. The first second. General Vorn did not understand the smile. I told you that. I watched his certainty die, and I watched something worse take its place. Not fear, not yet, but the panic of a creature whose entire map of the world has just been proven wrong. And a creature like Vorn, when it panics, does not retreat. It escalates. His hand went to his side. Kesari officers carry a ceremonial blade. The Vorkesh, they call it. It's not a toy. It's a real weapon, edged with the same dark alloy their warships are plated in, and a Kesari general wears it the way the rest of us wear our own skin. To draw it is a formal act. It means a debt is being settled in blood. Vorn drew it. I heard 300 cadets gasp at once. I heard, up on the platform, someone shout Academy command, finally, far too late, General, stand down. But Vorn wasn't listening. Vorn had stopped being a general somewhere in that smile. He was just an old, proud animal that had been denied the one thing it needed, and now it was going to take it by force. He brought the blade up. The second. Here is the thing nobody who wasn't there will ever fully believe. Keen moved, but he did not move the way you'd expect. He didn't dodge. He didn't run. He didn't reach for a weapon of his own because cadets at a review don't carry weapons. He stepped into it. Toward the blade. Toward the general. The exact opposite of every instinct every other species in that field would have had. And as Vorn's arm came down, Keen's hand came up to meet it, not to block the blade, but to catch the wrist behind it. I saw the impact, human hand around Kesari wrist, and I saw Vorn's arm just stop. Dead. You have to understand what you're looking at when a human catches you. We talked about density back at the start, about bones and muscle and the way humans are built down at the level you can't see. A Kesari is strong, graceful, fast, 10,000 years of warrior breeding. But a human is dense. A human grip doesn't push against you. It anchors. Keen's hand closed around that gray wrist, and it was like watching a man take hold of a falling tower and simply decide it wouldn't fall. Vorn's whole body lurched as his own strike rebounded into him. The blade hung there in the air between them, going nowhere. And Vorn pulled. I watched him pull. I watched the general put everything he had into it, that long, elegant arm, every muscle in it, 10,000 years of pride. I watched the cord stand out in his neck. I watched him strain against the grip of a creature he had called livestock 30 seconds before. And the human hand did not move. The third second. This was when it broke. This was when I watched something happen to General Tarsk Vorn that I had never seen happen to anyone of his rank, his age, his bearing. I watched him become afraid. Real fear. The naked kind. The kind that strips away everything you've built over a lifetime and leaves just the frightened thing underneath. Because in that third second, Vorn understood completely, the way Keen had understood when he smiled, the full shape of the situation he was in. He had drawn a weapon on an unarmed cadet. He had struck that cadet first, without provocation, in front of 300 witnesses and the assembled high command. He had confessed, out loud, to giving the order at Cephras, a massacre of 3,000 civilians, on a parade ground wired for record on every cycle of the Founders' Review. And he was now being held, effortlessly, immovably, by the hand of the very creature he'd come to prove was a beast. And he could not break free, and everyone was watching, and there was nothing his 10,000 years of pride could do about any of it. The blade fell out of his hand. It rang against the stone. And General Tarsk Vorn started to beg. I wish I could tell you it was dignified. It wasn't. Let go, he said, quiet at first. Then louder, the smooth, cold voice cracking right down the middle. Let go of me. Let go. He pulled again, harder, and Keen let him pull, let him exhaust himself against that anchored grip, and the general's voice climbed into something I'd never imagined could come out of a Kesari throat. Please, please let me go. There it was. The word the whole galaxy said humans had to be taught, please, and it wasn't the human saying it. I looked at Keen's face. I needed to know what he was feeling because I knew I was maybe the only one on that field who knew that this wasn't really about the slap. The slap was nothing. Keen had taken worse on the training mats and laughed about it after. This was about Cephras. This was about 3,000 people, and somewhere in that crowd of 3,000, I would learn later, there had been a child named Darrow Keen, 6 years old, pulled out of the wreckage of a refugee shelter by a rescue worker who told him not to look back. He'd been 4 years old when General Vorn gave the order. He didn't remember his parents' faces. He remembered the order being given in a way, not the words, but the shape of his whole life, bent around it. And now the man who'd done it was on his knees in front of him, begging. Keen could have killed him. I want to be clear about that. In that moment, with that grip, with the law on his side and the whole field as witness to an unprovoked attack, Keen could have ended Tarsk Vorn and walked away clean. No tribunal would have convicted him. It would have been self-defense by every code in the coalition. He could have closed his hand. He could have picked up the fallen blade. He could have made the ledger balance the way Vorn's own people would have understood, debt for debt, blood for blood, 3,000 for one. Every instinct his species supposedly had was screaming for it. And he didn't do it. He held Vorn there for one more breath, long enough for the general to feel the whole weight of where he was, long enough for 300 cadets and a platform full of high command to see, beyond any possible doubt, exactly what had happened and who had started it. Then Keen leaned down, and he said something to Vorn, low, just for him, that I only learned the words of years later when Keen finally told me himself. He said, I had you, you know I had you, and I'm letting you live, not because you deserve it, because I decided, that's the difference between us. I get to choose. And he opened his hand. Vorn fell back onto the stone. The proud general, sprawled on the parade ground he'd come to inspect, in the blood of the cadet he'd struck. He didn't get up. He couldn't, I think. Something in him had come apart that wasn't going to go back together. And Keen straightened up, turned to face the reviewing platform, blood still running down his cheek, and snapped to attention. Perfect form. Like none of it had happened. Like he was just a cadet at a review, waiting for orders. Sir, he called up to Academy Command, in that steady voice, requesting the witnesses be logged before anyone leaves this field. That was the part that finished Vorn, not the grip, not the begging, that request. Because the moment those witnesses were logged, and they were, all 300 of us, every instructor, every member of high command, plus the full record of the Founders' Review, General Tarsk Vorn was finished. There was no version of events he could spin. He'd struck first. He'd drawn first. He'd confessed to Cephras with his own mouth. And the only blood spilled on that field was the blood of an unarmed cadet who'd kept his hands at his sides until a blade came down at him. The tribunal lasted 11 days. They tried to bury it at first. Of course they did. Vorn had powerful friends, and the Kesari delegation pushed hard to have the whole thing handled internally, which everyone understood to mean handled never. But there were 300 witnesses and a record, and one thing the Kesari had not accounted for. They'd built their whole society on honor, on the ledger, on the principle that a debt incurred must be paid, that there is no greater shame than to strike one who has given no offense, that a warrior who draws on the unarmed and then begs for his life has forfeited everything that makes him a warrior. Their own code convicted him. By their own laws, Tarsk Vorn was not a casualty of human aggression. He was a coward who'd shamed his entire line. The Kesari, in the end, didn't defend him. They couldn't. To defend him would have meant admitting their sacred honor was just a costume they wore when it was convenient. They stripped his rank. They stripped his name. That's why you won't find it in the official histories. And the Cephras confession, logged in front of high command, reopened an inquiry that had been closed for lack of evidence for 40 years. 3,000 names finally got an answer to the question of who. Vorn lived. Keen saw to that. The greatest punishment they could give a creature like Vorn wasn't death. It was being made to live, nameless and shamed, as the general who slapped a human cadet and was begging for mercy 3 seconds later. I went to see Keen that night, in the infirmary where they were sealing the cut on his cheek. It scarred. He kept the scar his whole life, wouldn't let them erase it, said he'd earned it. I asked him the question I'd been carrying around all day. I asked him why. Why he didn't kill Vorn when he could have, when everything, the law, the witnesses, the man's own crimes, 3,000 dead, was right there handing him the right to do it. He was quiet for a long time. The dermal sealer hummed against his cheek. Finally he said, "You know what Vorn wanted, more than he wanted to hurt me." He looked at me with those flat human eyes. He wanted to be right. He came here believing we were animals, and the worst thing I could do, worse than killing him, was prove him wrong. An animal would have killed him. A beast would have closed its hand. He shook his head slowly. I wasn't going to give that man the satisfaction of being the thing he died believing I was. I didn't say anything. I didn't have anything to say. I was a small, soft-boned creature from a species that survives by being too quiet to notice, and I had just watched my friend hold the most powerful man in the sector by the wrist and choose to let him live. And I understood, finally, the thing the whole galaxy had gotten wrong about humans. Everyone thought the dangerous thing about humans was that they didn't know when to give up. That was never it. The dangerous thing about humans is that they do know. They know exactly how far they can go. They know precisely what they're capable of, down in those dense bones, in that anchored grip, in that terrible patient stillness. They know they could close the hand. And they choose not to. That choice, the restraint, held by will alone, with every right and every reason and every instinct screaming the other way, that is the most frightening thing in the universe. Because a creature that strikes when it's angry can be predicted, can be managed, can be controlled. A creature that could strike and decides not to, and looks you in the eye while it decides. That's a creature you cannot rule. You can only hope it stays kind. Keen made captain eventually. Then more. I lost touch with the details. I went back home, taught at a small academy on my own world, told my students stories about the Coalition years. But I heard things. I heard he was the kind of officer other species asked for specifically when things got bad. Not because he was the deadliest, though he was dangerous enough. Because everyone who served under him knew, the way I knew, that here was a man who held the line by choice, and would never, ever cross the one he'd drawn for himself. The Kesari changed too in the years after. Slowly. They stopped speaking of graceful surrender as the mark of a civilized people. They started speaking quietly of something they'd seen on a parade ground on Meridian. A young human, blood on his face, holding a general's wrist, choosing mercy he had every right to withhold. They didn't have a word for it in their 10,000-year-old language. They had to make a new one. The closest I can give you, in your tongue, is this: the strength to nod. People ask me, when I tell this story, whether the title's true, whether a general really begged for mercy 3 seconds after slapping a human cadet. And I tell them yes, every word. I was there, 12 paces away, close enough to smell the burned metal stink and feel my own hands shaking. But I always tell them they're asking about the wrong 3 seconds. The 3 seconds that mattered weren't the ones where Vorn begged. Anyone can break a proud man. That's easy. That's the oldest trick in the galaxy. The 3 seconds that mattered came right after, when Darrow Keen had a general's life in the grip of his hand, with the law and the dead and his own 4-year-old self all telling him to close it, and he held those 3 seconds open and chose to let go. That's the part I want you to remember. Not the slap, not the begging. The open hand,